Legend of Zelda is one of my favorite franchises of all time, but unlike many people, I didn't grow up with it. When I first picked up Breath of the Wild a year ago, it was my first experience with the Zelda game. This means I have no nostalgia for the series whatsoever. Whether this is a good thing or not is subjective, but it does mean I should be able to provide an unbiased review. The Legend of Zelda is an action-adventure game released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1986. I'm going to be doing this review from two angles. I'm going to be looking at the game, all things considered, taking into account hardware limitations, the gaming landscape at the time, and the impact the game had on the community. I'm also going to be looking at the game as it stands now for modern players. Hopefully this should give you an all-around view of the game. Now with all that being said, let's get into the actual review. The game's story is fairly simple. The evil Ganon has stolen the Triforce of Power and kidnapped Princess Zelda. Luckily, Zelda manages to break the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces and scatters them all across the land of Hyrule. You can probably see where this is going. You play as Link, holder of the Triforce of Courage, and your job is to travel around the world into 8 dungeons, collect the pieces of the Triforce, slay Ganon, and save the princess. Fairly basic, but what did you expect? The place this game really shines is in the gameplay. Link controls wonderfully and you have a great sense of control with the character. Most of the game is played from the top-down perspective, but it does have certain side-scrolling segments which are extremely charming, seeing as how they're obviously only reskinned top-down rooms. When you fight, instead of swinging your sword like in later titles, you just kinda stab the spot in front of you. I understand this is due to hardware limitations, but it can get annoying only being able to attack enemies, which often have ranged attacks, from such a close range. To balance this out, anytime you're at max health you can shoot a sword beam, which does just as much damage as the sword itself, giving you a ranged attack. This is useful most of the time in the overworld, but I usually went without it in dungeons. The combat is immensely satisfying and can be a lot of fun, but some enemies, Darknuts and Wizrobes in particular, often seem cheap, and when you're thrown into a room full of them with fireballs being blasted at you, dungeons 6 and 8, it can seem unfair. Darknuts can't be hit from the front, and they deal a lot of damage. They don't seem to follow any predictable pattern and just run around the room twisting and turning while dealing damage and making it impossible to hit them. These are just 2 enemies though, and most of the enemies in the game are unique and satisfying, and ultimately the combat system is great, especially for a 30-year-old game. This game is, if Johnny doesn't mind me borrowing a term from him, a guide game. If you really want to enjoy yourself and get the best experience, you need to use a guide. I know some people, myself included, prefer to solve puzzles themselves, but this isn't a puzzle. This is madness. You can use a guide as much or as little as you want, but with some basic help, I was able to enter level 1 with the white sword and 5 hearts. Honestly, I think that using a guide really enhances the experience, and it definitely doesn't make the game too easy. The land of Hyrule is huge and expansive, and is completely insane for an NES game. On top of that, 1/3 of the screens in the overworld have some form of secret, so you should never get bored, especially with a guide. Most of your time, however, will be spent in one of Hyrule's 9 dungeons. The dungeons are challenging but also rewarding, but they do all follow the same pattern, which gets boring after a while. You enter a dungeon, find the item you need to either beat the boss, unlock something in the overworld, or get to the next dungeon, fight the boss, get a heart container, and another piece of the Triforce. The dungeons don't really have gimmicks like in later games, but they do spice things up with an occasional mini-boss, and the game really isn't long enough for this to matter, so you shouldn't get bored. As you progress through the game, you get more health and better gear, which makes you feel stronger, and it really is fulfilling. As I touched on earlier, the enemies in this game provide plenty of variety, but the bosses leave a bit to be desired. Oftentimes, a really hard dungeon will be followed up by an extremely easy boss. One dungeon straight up uses the same boss from Dungeon 1, no changes at all, and another boss can be killed by just equipping your arrows and spamming B as the room loads. I personally don't really mind easy bosses in games, and I feel like the dungeons themselves provide enough challenge, but a lot of people really like hard bosses, and you just won't find them here. A few other minor things that I would like to talk about. This is one of the first games to actually provide an internal save feature. However, you can't just access this from a menu like in later games. The save option is only available when you die. Alternatively, there is a glitch where you can access the menu with a second controller, but the game still treats it like you died, dropping you to 3 hearts and putting you back at spawn. If you play on Virtual Console, you have save state, so it's not a problem, but if you play on an actual NES, you don't have many options. Second, I want to talk about the graphics. Obviously, this is an NES game, so everything is 8-bit, nothing new here, but the pixel art is superb, and everything is displayed beautifully. The Legend of Zelda is one of the most influential video games of all time. It created its own extremely popular genre, for crying out loud. And it wasn't so successful because it sucks. It has its kinks and a fair share of flaws, but ultimately I had a fantastic time playing it. It was hard to assign a number value, but after careful consideration, I feel The Legend of Zelda deserves a 7 out of 10 rating. Thanks for watching my review of The Legend of Zelda. This is my first time doing a scripted video, and this part isn't scripted, which is probably a horrible idea. But yeah, this is my first time writing a script, this is my first time reading a script, this is my first time writing a review, so a lot of firsts here, but hopefully it was decent, and hopefully Nintendo doesn't completely strike me down for all of the music in this video. That'd be good.